Osteoarthritis, if you've ever felt that ache, the stiffness, maybe your knee just protesting when you walk, you know what it is. It's that condition where the cartilage, the cushion in your joints, particularly knees, hips, it just starts to wear down. And the really frustrating part, your body isn't really set up to just, rebuild that lost cartilage easily. It's a tough one.
Now, you shared some really interesting material with us looking into natural herbal compounds and what they might do for OAA, but you asked a very specific question, didn't you? Going beyond just managing the pain and stuff, can these natural things actually help regenerate the cartilage? That's really the core of what we're digging into today.
And that distinction, it's absolutely critical. I mean, when researchers talk about OA treatments, there's a whole spectrum. On one end, you've got things that just help with symptoms, reduce pain, maybe help you move better short term. Then there are things that might slow down the damage, kind of preserve what cartilage you still have. But the highest bar is finding something that can actually trigger the body to make new cartilage tissue, true regeneration or synthesis. Yeah, and the material you sent makes it clear that regeneration gets thrown around kind of loosely sometimes. Like the sources point out, even super common supplements, glucosamine, chondroitin, despite being really popular, they just haven't shown direct, solid human evidence that they cause new cartilage to grow in OA. Proving that kind of structural rebuilding in people, it's actually incredibly difficult.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to really get into these sources you gave us, pull out the key findings, see what the evidence really says about the specific herbs you're curious about, and, crucially, figure out what it all means for this possibility of actual cartilage regeneration. Let's jump in. Right, so before we dive into specific herbs like Boswellia or Curcumin, how do scientists even know what's happening inside the joint? I mean, they can't just keep doing surgery to look, right? This is where biomarkers come into play, isn't it?
Exactly. Biomarkers are biological signals. They're things you can measure, usually in blood or urine, sometimes joint fluid. They give objective clues about what's going on biologically, disease activity, progression, or maybe how someone's responding to treatment in a trial. Super useful tools in OA research. Though the sources are careful, they say there's no single gold standard biomarker that tells the whole story.
Yeah, the sources you share detail a few key types for cartilage health. First up, cartilage synthesis biomarkers. These basically signal that the body's machinery for building cartilage, specifically type 2 collagen, its main component is, switched on. The ones mentioned are PIIAMP and PIICP. If levels of these go up, it suggests collagen synthesis is active, which could mean repair is happening.
Okay, so synthesis markers suggest building is happening. What about the other side? Breakdown. Right. The flip side is cartilage degradation biomarkers. These are like fragments or enzymes that get released when cartilage is actually breaking down. The sources highlight CTX2, COMP, and MMP3. So if a treatment is working to protect the cartilage, you'd ideally want to see levels of these go down. That suggests less breakdown is occurring, what scientists call a chondroprotective effect.
Makes sense. And inflammation, that's a big part of OA too.
Absolutely. So they also track inflammatory biomarkers, things like IL-1, IL-6, TNF-alpha, HSCRP, ESR. Changes here tell researchers if the overall inflammatory environment, either locally in the joint or systemically, is improving or worsening.
Okay, so we get these metabolic clues from biomarkers, like are the builders busy? Or are the demolition crew working overtime? But here's the key question. If we see those synthesis markers, PIIAMP or PIICP, go up, does that automatically mean we'd see thicker new cartilage if we took a picture like an MRI?
And this is where the sources bring in that really crucial nuance.
It's a great point. Seeing synthesis markers increase tells you the metabolic machinery is active. The body is sort of trying to build, but, and this is a big but, it doesn't automatically mean that effort translates into visible, significant changes in the physical structure of the cartilage, like its actual volume or thickness or how intact it looks on a scan.
So the signal is there, but maybe not the finished product.
Kind of. The sources give a really clear example with a curcumin study they reviewed. Curcumin did a good job reducing pain, great symptom relief. But the study explicitly reported no significant difference in things like the amount of fluid or inflammation visible inside the joint or in the cartilage composition when they looked using MRI.
Interesting. So feeling better didn't directly correlate with structural change on the scan in that case. Exactly. It highlights that while biomarker changes are promising, right, they suggest a better environment for cartilage health. They aren't definitive proof of structural restoration or, significant new tissue actually forming. You need that next level of evidence. And maintaining that scientific rigor is so important when we talk about regeneration.
That's a really vital distinction. Okay, so separating the metabolic signals from the actual physical structure.
Got it.
Yeah.
With that, framework symptoms, degradation markers, synthesis markers, and an actual structural imaging. Let's look at the specific compounds you shared info on. The sources seem to really focus on a combination of Boswellia serrata and celery seed extract. They suggest it might have some of the most compelling human evidence, especially on those biomarkers. What did the research find there? Yeah, the sources definitely put a spotlight on that combo. They focus mainly on one key clinical trial. It's pretty well designed. 62 people with NEOA, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, ran for 90 days. The dose was specific: 300 milligrams of Boswellia plus 250 milligrams of celery seed extract daily, so 550 milligrams total. They also mention a much larger trial, over 1,200 patients, which apparently backed up the findings on improving symptoms.
Okay, so focusing on that 62-person trial.
Yeah.
How did it actually impact how people felt, their pain, their function? Give us the numbers.
Well, the symptomatic relief reported was pretty striking, according to the data presented. Overall pain, using the VAS scale, the treatment group saw a massive drop, 67.7% reduction. Compare that to just 7.5% for the placebo group. Yeah. And the WOMAC score that looks at pain, stiffness, and function, the total score went down by 64% in the treatment group versus only 4.4% for placebo.
Yeah.
Breaking it down, WOMAC pain specifically fell by 78.2% and stiffness by 78%. Those are really significant changes.
Huge improvements in how people felt. What about actually moving around their physical function?
That improved significantly too. The immobility part of WOMAC dropped by 57.8%. And in the 6-minute walk test, how far people could walk, the treatment group increased their distance by over 57 meters. The placebo group, only about 2 meters.
Big difference.
Huge difference. Even fatigue, measured by Filet fatigue, was reduced by nearly 41%. The sources also noted something interesting. The pain relief seemed to last even a month after people stopped taking the supplement, and they needed less rescue pain medication.
Okay, those are genuinely impressive results for symptoms and function. Fantastic for someone living with OA daily. But let's circle back to our main question. Did this Boswellia celery combo show anything about the cartilage itself? Those synthesis and degradation biomarkers we talked about.
Yes, and according to the sources, this is where this particular combination showed some really unique findings, especially compared to other compounds reviewed. Quite potentially exciting. So looking at synthesis first, those signs of building activities. Serum PIIANP, that type 2 collagen marker, it went up substantially by 45.38%. And serum PIICP, another collagen synthesis marker, also increased significantly by 46.03%. The sources interpret these jumps as strong indicators that this combo is actively promoting collagen synthesis, suggesting it's contributing to cartilage repair or regeneration processes.
So signals for building are up. What about breakdown, degradation?
That's the other part of the story. They saw significant reductions in degradation markers. CTX2, a key breakdown product, dropped by over 41% in serum and nearly 30% in urine. COMP levels decreased by almost 39%, and MMP3, that's an enzyme that chews up the cartilage matrix, it saw a really impressive reduction, 46.43%.
Wow, so it's hitting both sides, promoting building and reducing demolition.
That's what the biomarker data suggests, yeah. And as you might expect with Boswellia and celery, the inflammation markers also went down significantly. Things like IL-6 dropped by over 66%, HSCRP by nearly 56%. Creating a less inflammatory joint environment is definitely a plus.
Okay, so this is a really compelling story. From the biomarkers, synthesis up, degradation down, inflammation down. Did the study look for any direct evidence, any imaging to see if these metabolic changes actually led to structural changes in the joint?
They did, yes. And this blend had a finding that the sources flagged as noteworthy, though they describe it as more indirect evidence for regeneration. They used X-rays to look at the knee joint space. And in several patients in the group taking the OBL combo, they observed improvements and increase in that joint space.
X-rays aren't perfect for seeing cartilage itself, are they?
No, definitely not as detailed as MRI for the cartilage tissue. But an increase in the space between the bones is a measurable structural change in the joint's overall architecture. And the study authors, as reported in your sources, felt this finding was consistent with everything else, the symptom relief, the better function, and they suggested it was indicative of early cartilage repair. So the sources kind of frame it like this. You've got the strong symptom relief, the really positive biomarker shifts, both synthesis and degradation, plus this unique radiological hint. Together, they argue it builds a multifaceted and compelling argument for the potential for regeneration with this combo, moving beyond just slowing breakdown. But it's crucial, as the sources note, it was seen in several patients, not all of them. Still, it's a piece of structural evidence that stands out compared to what was reported for other compounds.
That is fascinating. Symptoms, biomarkers, and a structural hint, even if indirect. How do the sources think this combination might actually work? What are the proposed mechanisms?
Well, the thinking is it's likely a synergistic effect, the two ingredients working together. Boswellia is well known for its strong anti-inflammatory action. It inhibits things like TNF-alpha, IL-6, and key enzymes like 5-LOX and KOX2. Its active compound, AKBA, is particularly noted for this. It also seems to have protective effects, reducing those MMP enzymes and helping maintain the cartilage matrix components like collagen.
And the celery seed.
Celery seed extract is mentioned as a natural COX2 inhibitor too, but it also brings other things to the table. Compounds like apigenin, manganese, which is important for enzymes involved in forming cartilage, and thalides, which might help with inflammation and muscle relaxation. The sources even mention unique actives like serrata and uricalic acid, specifically linking them to potentially driving tissue repair processes, so a multi-pronged attack, potentially.
Okay. And critically, how safe did this combination appear to be in the trials?
The sources consistently reported an excellent safety profile, really well tolerated. They stated there were no severe adverse effects reported in the clinical trials, no concerning changes in physical exams, lab tests, or ECGs either.
That's good news.
Yeah, and one finding the sources highlighted as particularly notable was about digestion. Participants who already had mild or moderate stomach issues, like heartburn, actually reported improvements in those symptoms while taking the blend. That's a really positive contrast to something like NSAIDs, right, which are pretty notorious for causing stomach problems.
Definitely. Makes it more attractive for long-term use.
Exactly. That favorable safety profile is a big plus when you're talking about managing a chronic condition like OA.
What were the main limitations pointed out in the sources regarding the specific Boswellia celery research, especially concerning regeneration?
A key limitation flagged for that main 62-person trial was that they excluded obese patients, anyone with a BMI of 30 or higher.
That's a significant group in OA.
It is. Since obesity is a major risk factor and often makes OA worse, excluding them limits how much you can generalize the findings to everyone with OA. So the sources definitely recommend needing bigger trials, running for longer periods, and specifically including a more diverse group of people, older adults, people with more severe OA, and definitely people across different BMI ranges to really understand the long-term effects and who benefits most.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's switch gears now to curcumin, the active compound in turmeric. It has such a huge reputation, doesn't it? Especially as an anti-inflammatory. What do the sources say about its potential in OA, particularly looking beyond just the pain relief aspect?
Oh yeah, curcumin's reputation is well-deserved for symptoms and inflammation in OA. The sources absolutely confirm that. Lots of human trials using different doses, different lengths of time, consistently show it helps. People report less pain measured on scales like KOs or just numeric ratings. Function gets better too. Things like timed walking tests improve. Some studies even suggest it works about as well as NSAIDs for improving function, but potentially with fewer side effects.
Fewer side effects is always good.
Definitely. And they also note findings about needing less pain medication. One trial saw a 37% drop in analgesic use in the curcumin group compared to just 13% in the placebo group. So clear benefits for symptoms and inflammation.
And curcumin is almost legendary in the lab, right? In preclinical studies looking at cells in dishes or in animal models, what does that research show about cartilage?
It really is. The in vitro, that's the lab dish stuff, and the preclinical evidence for curcumin's effects on cartilage is consistently strong across the sources. These studies show it can stimulate chondrocytes, the cartilage cells, to multiply. It promotes production of collagen, the main building block, and it inhibits those MMP enzymes that break cartilage down. Animal models, like studies in rats with induced OA, have shown curcumin potentially increasing cartilage thickness, improving the structural appearance, and slowing degradation. One specific rat study cited showed a really remarkable 53.1% increase in collagen expression within the cartilage tissue after treatment. That's huge.
Wow, 53%.
Yeah. And there's even mention of promising early work using new delivery methods, like putting curcumin into hydrogels for direct application in animal models. So the potential suggested by preclinical work is definitely there.
Okay, so you got this really powerful preclinical story suggesting it should help build cartilage. But then what happens when you look at human trials using advanced imaging? Does that potential translate? Do they see structural regeneration?
And this is the crucial sticking point that the sources highlight specifically for curcumin. Despite all that compelling preclinical data suggesting it can boost synthesis, the human clinical trials that have used direct imaging like MRI to actually measure cartilage volume or thickness or its composition, these trials have not consistently shown significant structural cartilage regeneration.
So the human imaging isn't matching the lab results consistently.
Pretty much. The sources detail specific findings. One randomized trial, 70 patients, 12 weeks, using curcuma longa extract. Yes, it reduced pain, but the researchers reported no significant difference between groups for change in effusion synovitis volume or cartilage composition on MRI. Another study, this one went for 12 months, used a specific bioavailable curcumin formulation after patients had a type of cartilage repair surgery. It also found no significant difference in MRI measurements of cartilage quality using something called T2 mapping.
No difference on MRI.
Right. Now, interestingly, in that same post-surgery study, when surgeons actually went back in for a second look with a camera arthroscopy, they did report seeing significantly better cartilage stiffness and smoother surfaces in the curcumin group.
Okay, so that's a bit contradictory. Visual inspection looked better, but the objective MRI measure didn't show a difference.
Exactly. It's a bit mixed. A positive sign from the direct look, but the quantitative MRI data didn't back it up in that instance. And another exploratory trial apparently showed a reduction in one specific degradation marker in the blood, COL2-1, but didn't find significant changes in other cartilage biomarkers they measured. So the picture from human structural studies is, well, inconsistent.
Okay, that definitely feels like a disconnect. Powerful lab data, strong preclinical results, but then the human imaging isn't consistently showing that structural payoff. Why? What do the sources suggest is the reason for this gap? What's the roadblock?
The sources really zero in on one major challenge, especially for curcumin taken orally. It's inherently low bioavailability.
Meaning it doesn't get absorbed well.
Exactly. They call it a fundamental pharmacokinetic limitation. Basically, when you swallow curcumin, your body doesn't absorb very much of the active compound into your bloodstream. And if it's not absorbed well, not enough of it actually reaches the target tissues, like the cartilage inside your knee joint, at a high enough concentration to have those powerful effects seen in the lab.
So if it can't get there in sufficient amounts?
Then the amazing things it does in a petri dish or in a rat model where they might use higher doses or different delivery methods just aren't likely to happen effectively in vivo inside a person's joint. The sources strongly suggest this bioavailability issue is a primary reason why we haven't seen consistent proof of structural regeneration in human trials yet. They really stress that overcoming this using or developing formulations that are much better absorbed is absolutely critical for future research trying to prove structural benefits. It's seen as kind of a prerequisite.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. What about curcumin's general mechanisms, aside from the bioavailability issue? How is it thought to work?
Well, its main established effects are being a potent anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. It also seems to be anti-apoptotic, meaning it helps prevent excessive cell death, which can happen in OA. It works by interfering with key pro-inflammatory signals, things like IL-1 beta, IL-6, TNF-alpha. It neutralizes damaging free radicals. It modulates important cellular pathways involved in OA progression, like NF-kappa B. And like we mentioned from the preclinical work, it inhibits those MMP enzymes that break down the cartilage matrix. So it definitely has chondroprotective effects, helping shield the existing cartilage cells from damage.
And safety-wise, how does curcumin stack up?
Generally very good, according to the sources. Well tolerated in the clinical studies they reviewed, considered safe at the typical oral doses used, and many trials reported no significant side effects compared to placebo.
So summing up the limitations for curcumin, specifically regarding regeneration, what are the key takeaways from the sources?
The main ones highlighted are, first, the lack of consistent, direct structural evidence coming from human imaging studies, particularly quantitative MRI. Second, that major challenge of low oral bioavailability, which really needs to be tackled effectively to get enough curcumin to the joint. And third, consequently, there's a need for more robust, targeted clinical trials that are specifically designed with objective structural outcomes like changes in cartilage thickness or volume on MRI set as their primary goal, not just looking at symptoms.
Okay, so we've taken a pretty deep dive now into the evidence presented for these two main players, the Boswellia-celery combination and curcumin. And the sources briefly touched on others like ginger or pomegranate. So, stepping back, what's the big picture the sources paint? When we ask that fundamental question, can these herbs truly regenerate cartilage in humans with OA?
Yeah, synthesizing the material you shared, the picture is. Well, it's nuanced. There's definite value, but also clear limits right now regarding proven regeneration. First off, many herbal compounds do offer significant valuable benefits in OA, that's clear. They can provide excellent relief from symptoms, pain, stiffness, and improve function. That's incredibly important for people's quality of life. They're also often effective at reducing inflammation and inhibiting those cartilage-degrading enzymes. These are crucial outcomes, making them valuable tools for managing the condition.
So good for management, symptoms, slowing breakdown.
Yes. Now, specifically on promoting synthesis or regeneration, among the compounds reviewed in your sources, the Boswellia celery combination seems to present the strongest current human clinical evidence suggesting it actively promotes synthesis. That's based on those significant increases they saw in the PIA-NP and PIACP synthesis biomarkers, combined with the big drops in degradation markers, plus that unique, though indirect, X-ray finding of increased joint space in some patients, hinting at an early repair effect.
And curcumin.
Curcumin is clearly a potent anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. It shows really strong preclinical evidence for potentially boosting synthesis. But, as we discussed, the human trials using direct imaging haven't consistently shown structural regeneration. Its most solidly proven effects in humans are definitely for symptoms, inflammation, and helping to slow down the degradation process.
What about the others mentioned briefly, like ginger or green tea?
The sources suggest that others like ginger, pomegranate, green tea, resveratrol generally show benefits for symptoms and inflammation. But they seem to have less direct or consistent human evidence specifically looking at or showing positive results for stimulating cartilage synthesis markers compared to what was reported for the Boswellia celery blend. And they use glucosamine and chondroitin as that benchmark, again, just reiterating the lack of direct human proof for regeneration there too.
So it really sounds like that highest bar, true quantifiable regeneration, like actually measuring new cartilage thickness or volume with something like an MRI. The evidence for any of these compounds consistently hitting that specific mark in humans is still, well, emerging at best, based on these sources.
Absolutely. That's a key takeaway. The sources effectively describe this hierarchy of evidence, right? You start with symptom relief, easiest to show, then reducing inflammation, then reducing degradation biomarkers, then harder still, showing increased synthesis biomarkers, then even trickier, getting indirect structural hints like X-ray changes. And right at the very top, the gold standard for proving structural regeneration is demonstrating direct quantifiable structural changes using advanced imaging like quantitative MRI, seeing the cartilage actually change.
And where do these compounds fit on that ladder?
Based on the review, the Boswellia celery blend shows promising signals climbing up to those middle rungs synthesis biomarkers and that indirect imaging hint. Curcumin is strong on the lower rungs, symptoms, inflammation, degradation, with great potential, suggested by preclinical work for the higher rungs. But the sources indicate that none of them have consistently and robustly reached that top rung level 6 definitive proof of structural regeneration in humans via imaging yet. That remains the central limitation when you're talking strictly about proven regeneration.
Okay. Given all that, what needs to happen next? What do the sources recommend for research to get more definitive answers, especially about hitting that top rung of proof?
The sources lay out some pretty clear recommendations for future research to really nail this down. First, critically, they call for larger sample sizes and longer duration trials. The human studies mentioned often had, 60 or 70 people for maybe 3 or 6 months. That's likely too small and too short to reliably detect structural changes in cartilage, which happens really slowly. And you need longer trials to see long-term effects too.
Bigger and longer makes sense for slow changes.
Right. They also stress including diverse patient populations. We need studies that cover the whole range of OA severity from early to advanced. And they need to include people with different characteristics, like different BMIs, older adults, the groups often excluded from early studies, but who represent a lot of people with OA.
And what about measuring the outcome?
This is probably the most critical point. The need to use advanced imaging techniques as primary endpoints. This means routinely using things like quantitative MRI measuring cartilage volume, thickness, T2 mapping for quality as the main objective outcome to prove or disprove structural regeneration. The sources emphasize moving beyond relying mainly on patient questionnaires or just indirect biomarkers if the goal is to prove structural change. Need that direct visual proof.
So focus on the pictures.
Essentially, yes, objective pictures. Other key things mentioned are standardization using well-characterized herbal extracts so you know exactly what's in them and how much, and focusing on enhanced bioavailability, especially for compounds like curcumin, to make sure enough gets to the joint. And finally, more mechanistic research to really understand how these compounds might work at a cellular level in human joints to stimulate cartilage building.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive really shows what a complex and honestly fascinating area this is. We clearly have herbal compounds with real, evidence-backed benefits for making people feel better, reducing inflammation, slowing down the damage, and that's huge in itself. And with the Boswellia celery combination, there are these intriguing hints about stimulating synthesis markers and even some early structural changes on X-ray. Definitely seems to warrant more investigation using those top-tier imaging methods. But that ultimate proof clear, objective evidence of significant new cartilage actually forming in humans, measured rigorously, that still seems to be the goalpost the research is actively working towards, according to these sources. So we've journeyed through the sources you share, really looking closely at what compounds like the Boswellia celery blend and curcumin might offer for osteoarthritis. We tackled that key question about actual cartilage regeneration and tried to critically examine the evidence, separating out symptom relief, slowing damage, and actual tissue rebuilding.
And it's clear, isn't it? These natural options definitely hold significant value for managing OA symptoms, helping with inflammation, supporting joint health by slowing degradation. That's not trivial at all. The Boswellia and celery seed combination specifically shows those really intriguing signals, the synthesis markers, with early structural hints that absolutely deserve follow-up with more advanced quantitative methods like MRI. Curcumin remains this powerhouse anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. Its preclinical promise for synthesis is exciting, but that potential still needs to be conclusively proven with human structural evidence, and a big part of that puzzle is likely cracking that bioavailability challenge.
Yeah, the sources really hammered home that crucial difference, didn't they?
Yeah.
Between feeling better or slowing the damage down and actually rebuilding the tissue. And the scientific bar for proving that last one, true regeneration, it's justifiably very high. It demands those objective measures like the advanced imaging that can actually see and quantify new cartilage.
Exactly. It really underscores the complexity of OA itself and why we need rigorous science when evaluating any potential therapy, especially when you see claims about regeneration being made. It's easy to make the claim, much harder to prove it to that standard.
So for you, the listener, maybe the key takeaway from digging into these sources is this. Herbal compounds can offer real, significant benefits for managing your OA, helping with pain, function, inflammation, and protecting existing cartilage. That's well supported for many. But when you hear or read claims specifically about regeneration rebuilding the cartilage, it's really important to look closely at the level of evidence. Are they talking about symptom scores, biomarkers, or do they have that highest level proof? Objective, structural changes shown through advanced imaging. Because as our sources show, that top-level proof for these specific compounds is still something researchers are actively working to establish. And maybe the most provocative thought to leave you with coming out of this deep dive isn't just if these compounds have the biological potential to rebuild cartilage, the lab work often suggests they might. But it's the significant challenge, highlighted again and again in the sources, of whether we can actually get enough of these active compounds in the damaged tissue inside the human joint to effectively unleash that potential and achieve meaningful, measurable regeneration where it counts. That delivery problem, it might be just as crucial as the compound itself. Gives you something to think about.